Again, my name is Beth Wemagwas. I'm the program coordinator and curator here at the Historical Society. I've been with the museum now for 10 years as of November, which is exciting for me. I can't believe I've been here that long, but it's been a fantastic trip. So the most recent exhibit that I have curated here at the Historical Society is Restful Resorts, Cottages, Community, and Change. And the exhibit is all about, again, that time period from about 1870 to 1900 when our small little Odawa village, up and coming logging town, changed into this really huge resort tourist destination. So that's what we'll be talking about tonight. This presentation is a complement to the exhibit. If you haven't gotten a chance to see the exhibit, I strongly encourage you to visit us in the next few weeks before the exhibit comes down off display to prepare for the next one. A quick plug for some of our other upcoming programs. We have 2 more Zooms coming up after this one. The next one is on February 1st at 7 o'clock. It is with the secretary, the executive secretary of the Mackinac Bridge, Kim Nowak. And she will be coming to talk about the history of the Mighty Mac, its building, its construction, and she's given this lecture for us. I think it's been 4 or 5 years now, but Ms. Nowak is fantastic, and her presentation is something you do not want to miss. So if you haven't already signed up for this, I encourage you to go to our website, register. You can register for this talk and other talks at the same time. Just add both of them to your cart when you check out. And after this lecture, we have one on February 22nd, which is all about Company K, the Michigan sharpshooting unit made up completely of Anishinaabe soldiers during the Civil War. So you can find all of that and more on our website, harborspringshistory.org, and sign up for those programs. We really encourage you to sign up early for them. You receive the Zoom link for those about a day in advance. And if for some reason you don't get the Zoom link, you should definitely get in touch with me, and I'll make sure that you do. We are also going to be part of Ice Fest again this year, coming up. I believe that is the Saturday, the February 10th. So again, check our website for that information about upcoming programming. We're also on Facebook and Instagram and on YouTube. So please check us out there. So without much further ado, we're going to get into the lecture itself, the meat and potatoes of why you're all here. And we are starting about 14,000 years ago. It's a very good place to start. We're starting with how the glaciers formed Michigan, because the natural and geological history of our area is really an important part of our local history. So the glaciers building of the Great Lakes began about 14 to 12,000 years ago when the Laurentide ice sheet, this huge, almost mile-high glacier, began retreating from our area. And as it retreated, it begins to melt and it leaves behind mixtures of sand, clay, rocks, and those create these huge, what are called moraines, glacial moraines. And these are those deposits and hills that are left behind. Some of them rise to 750 feet above Lake Michigan, and those are our local ski resorts today. Those are Harbor Highlands, Nub Knob, Boyne Mountain, and not only did those glaciers, as they melt, deposit these hills, but they also carved out the lakes as we know them today. They carved out our deep natural harbor, and they formed the different bluffs that we see in town. The bluff just behind 3rd Street here in Harbor Springs is actually an ancient shore of Lake Nipissing. And the ancient shoreline of Lake Algonquin forms another one of those sort of terraced bluffs that we can see in our area. Now, Harbor Springs, as you might imagine, as I mentioned, our local history is tied very strongly to our geological history. The deep natural harbor here in Harbor Springs obviously is the first part of our name. The springs part of our name comes from the natural artesian wells and springs that are found throughout the region. This is my very quick demonstration of how an artesian well works. I am not a geologist in any form, but basically a confined aquifer that is confined, in our case, actually by a special layer of impermeable clay called marl. Marl confines this aquifer and puts it under pressure. And whether man-made, natural, or otherwise, when you drill down into that confined aquifer, the pressure releases and turns into these natural flowing wells. This picture on the right here is one of those flowing wells in Wequitansing. There are many of them throughout Harbor Springs. If you ever walk downtown Harbor Springs, the water fountains that you pass are all natural artesian wells. So, Harbor Springs, we are named for our natural features, and keep that in mind, because as we move forward in history, it's going to become a big part of the reason that people move to our area and the reason that the resorts begin to come up here in northern Michigan. Now, I do a lecture called A History of Harbor Springs, part 1 and part 2. They're up on our YouTube page, and I go into a much deeper depth of the founding of Harbor Springs as we know it. But we do need some background on that in order to understand this era from 1870 to 1900 when our resorts are founded. So we're backtracking a little bit here to get to the era that we are focusing on tonight. Now, we're not going too terribly far back, just to 1829. 1829 is when a group of local Odawa who had been since 1742 settled at the Goodhart Middle Village area. They broke away from that village and moved south to a place that they called Wequitansing, which in the Odawa language means little bay place or small bay place. And they founded what we now know as Harbor Springs, but what they called at the time Wequitansing. And they built Holy Childhood Church. You can see it on the left there, and on the right, the school and rectory. So again, I want to acknowledge that we are moving past a great deal of history here to get to the era we're talking about tonight. We're moving all the way past New France, the fur trade, the French and Indian War, moving right up to when after the French and Indian War, the British took control of our area from the French. After the War of 1812, the Americans take control of our area from the British. And it's in the wake of the War of 1812, leading up to the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that President Andrew Jackson signs, that we find the founding of Little Traverse, Harbor Springs, Wequitansing. And really the creation of Wequitansing is in response to this looming threat of removal. There are tribes in southern Michigan that are already being removed at this point, and it is the Catholic priests in the area with which the local Odawa were familiar and were friendly, who suggest that the Catholic Odawa split from the main group at Goodhart and move to found a European-style town, dedicate themselves fully to assimilation, to adopting as many of the European American-style lifeways as possible in order to prevent their removal from Little Traverse and their forced removal from their homeland. So in some ways, this is the Odawa leadership seeing settlement coming towards them and knowing that northern Michigan is the next frontier and beating those settlers to the punch by creating a European-style town ahead of them. Now, as I mentioned, the Indian Removal Act happens in 1830, and the Odawa fight against that. After the War of 1812, that fight increasingly is no longer an actual war with soldiers. It is an intellectual and government sort of war. It's about negotiations. It's about treaties. And in order for them to compete in that new type of battlefield arena, the Odawa count on several of their children who they have sent to be educated to take charge and become the leaders of their community during this time. Several of them, again, this could be its own lecture, but on the left we have pictured Kanapima, he who is talked about. He also goes by Augustine Hamlin Jr., and Augustine Hamlin Jr. actually studied at the Vatican in Rome, and he was fluent in both Latin, French, English, and Anishinaabe-Mowen, the Odawa language. He was a pivotal leader and interpreter during 1836 when some of the first treaties with the United States government were signed. The Treaty of 1836, which is the Treaty of Washington, cedes 14 million acres of land, roughly 37% of the current state of Michigan. So this yellow area that you can see here is the land that was ceded by the Ojawa and Ojibwe and Chippewa tribes of Michigan to the United States government in exchange for the ability to stay in certain reservations of land. And for the local Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians, that is Little Traverse. That is Wequitansing here in Harbor Springs. There are other treaties that are signed specifically in the 1855 Treaty of Detroit. That treaty in 1855 is one that we're particularly concerned with because it puts a limit on European or white settlement in the area for about 20 years. And during that time, there are some exceptions, of course. The local Odawa can sell their land directly to European settlers if they want. Some of the land around Little Traverse was open. It's an extremely complex and convoluted sort of system. And once you get through that complicated quagmire of legalese, land speculation, timber barons, bureaucracy, to get down to the meat of the treaties, it gets very complicated. So what we're concerned about is those dates. So the 1836 treaty, happening just a few years after the Indian Removal Act, secures the Odawa in their place in northern Michigan. The 1855 treaty puts that 20-year time limit on other settlement in northern Michigan. So here we are in Wequitansing, the town that is founded in 1829 by the Odawa. Here you can see Holy Childhood Church. This image is roughly from, I've seen different dates on it. I've seen dates of 1858. I've seen dates of 1878. Either way, it's extremely early. You can see Harbor Point is completely unsettled. You just have Holy Childhood Church and a little bit of other government buildings, trading centers, homes, that sort of thing. And in 1861, we have another important date. 1861 is when we are officially incorporated as a town called Little Traverse, and we get a post office. So having a post office is a big deal, and our name is initially Little Traverse, named after Little Traverse Bay. They don't stick with the Odawa name at that point. So 1861, we are still under that early 1855 treaty, and so Harbor Springs, or Little Traverse at this time, is primarily an Odawa village with a few traders. In about 1853, we get the first sort of European Maine settler. His name is Richard Cooper. He arrives on the schooner Eliza Caroline and opens a general store in the area for a local captain named Kirkland. Mr. Cooper was actually a fisher on Beaver Island, and moved his operation first to Little Traverse and then later to Charlevoix after the advent of King Strang and the Mormon stronghold on Beaver Island. So by 1861, again, we have a post office now, but we're primarily still a small Odawa town with a few traders and some a few, missionaries and lumbermen, but really just a few people. But something happens exactly 20 years after the treaty limitations expire in 1855 from that treaty. So it's 1875 and the railroad arrives. Now, technically, the railroad arrived in Petoskey in about 1873 or so. The rails were actually built and it began running by 1874, 1875. But 1875 is generally the year that I go with. And you can see two of the different stations. This is the station in Petoskey, one of the main suburban station, and this is the depot in Harbor Springs. This is much later, obviously, not 1875. But 1875 is when the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad arrives in Petoskey. At the height of summer traffic, which won't be for another couple decades, but around the turn of the century, the era that we're looking at tonight, there is a train arriving or leaving the Petoskey Depot every 15 minutes. So it is a busy, busy place. The train doesn't reach Little Traverse or Harbor Springs until 1882. That's when they complete a branch from Petoskey over to Harbor Springs and actually all the way up to Mackinac at that point as well. As many of you probably know, railroads are the hub of town. They are the lifeblood of a town. And with the railroad comes business, comes commerce. And the people of Harbor Springs, once they saw the railroad get to Petoskey and saw the economic boom that it incited in that area, worked extremely hard and raised, honestly, most of the money to fund the railroad's extension to Harbor Springs. They were buying bonds, they were working with the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad because the people knew how important it was to get that railroad to our area. So the railroad arrives, and the railroad, it didn't just come to Petoskey initially because Petoskey was a suddenly, booming place. It wasn't that Petoskey was a booming town and so the railroad came. It goes the other way. The railroad came and then Petoskey became a booming town. The railroads were initially in northern Michigan because of the logging industry, and they had invested significant funds in infrastructure and laying rail lines into northern Michigan in order to transport lumber out. Because the lumber boom by this time in about 1875 is really quieting down in southern Michigan, but in northern Michigan, it is just booming. We are at one point about 75% of our industry is connected to the logging and lumber trade in one way or another. So the railroads, not wanting to lose that investment in this infrastructure, start carrying passengers instead of lumber. And so it's a strategic decision to extend some of their rail lines from lumber centers into other places where they expect business and industry to begin thriving. And Petoskey was one of those places. Now, it's at this time that Harbor Springs becomes Harbor Springs. So, as I mentioned, in 1829, we are called Wequitansing. By 1861, we are Little Traverse with our own post office. But it's in 1881 that we officially change our name to Harbor Springs. You can see there are two newspaper articles here on the left talking about that change. They're from 1881, just after the name change. The one in April says, after the 18th of this month, the name of Little Traverse Post Office will assume the title of Harbor Springs. The other one reads, the Little Traverse people have, by one unwise act, wiped out the name around which houses so many memories and traditions by incorporating their town with the name of Harbor Springs. It will be Little Traverse still, arose by any other name. So people aren't particularly happy about the name change, but the name is changed because Harbor Springs is growing. And the leading men of the town, leading entrepreneurs, recognized that the name Harbor Springs will be more appealing to tourists as a place that you might want to come. And this is where we really get into sort of the topic of the exhibit and the topic of this presentation, which is that time period from 1870 to 1900 and how we grow as a community and the reasons that we grow and what's happening in this era. Well, in the 1870s, the nation is undergoing increasing urbanization, increasing industrialization, and there are, both of these forces are creating rather unpleasant conditions in these rapidly growing cities. So, hand in hand with the development of those cities, there is a renewed interest in getting away from these unpleasant conditions, these unsanitary conditions. And the Victorians have a renewed interest in health and a really strong belief that the environment is what is going to create that health. This philosophy is taken to the extreme by men like Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, whose world renowned health resort, the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which you can see right here on the right. It claimed to cure all sorts of diseases using hydrotherapy and other medical treatments. It claimed to cure tuberculosis, hay fever, asthma, cancer, all sorts of maladies. And I know it's a little difficult to read, but on this advertisement, it advertises things like Turkish Russian, solar, thermoelectric, and electro vapor baths of all kinds. I I sort of relate this nowadays to when everyone started really getting into Zumba and hot yoga and our sort of modern trends. This is the Victorian version, the Victorian interest in health and interest in finding a refuge from these cities. So northern Michigan is marketed as a place with pure air, with beautiful, clean water, where all of these baths and water cures could take place. And this wellness craze, this taking of the waters, this escape from these industrialized centers is a really strong marketing moment in our history. And Northern Michigan is marketed as a place where these middle and upper class citizens can get away and come to a more natural state. I really enjoy this quote here. This is from, let me see if I can find it. It's an essay that was written in 1878. And he says, I suspect that many of us are, after all, really camping temporarily in civilized conditions, and that going into the wilderness is an escape longed for into our natural and preferred state. And I love this image. This is Victorians camping. So in doing research for this exhibit, this was one of the things that I stumbled across that I had never particularly thought deeply about. But the Victorians are really the ones behind the first camping sort of craze. It goes hand in hand with this health and wellness becoming paramount in their society. You need to get away from it all and breathe in the natural air and breathe and be in these natural settings in order to really become a fully rounded person. This leads, of course, to the founding of the first national parks. Yellowstone is designated by President Grant in 1872. The second national park is actually Mackinac Island, which is transferred to being a state park instead of a national park in 1895. But this early movement, camping, pure air, Northern Michigan has both of these things in spades. So basically, you have the confluence of many different factors. The treaty limitations are running out. Logging has already uncovered northern Michigan, you could say. The secret is out that northern Michigan is this sort of rugged frontier where you can get away from it all and at the same time take in the curative air and water of pure Michigan. So I call this the first Pure Michigan campaign. I don't know when the state adopted that campaign officially, but I argue that it started in the 1870s. The transportation companies, again, who are transitioning from transporting things like lumber and freight to transporting people, really just go whole hog into this this idea, and they put all of their money into advertising summer resort getaways in northern Michigan. They advertise not just the natural beauty of the landscape and its health benefits, but all of the different sort of sports that you can do here. So, in particular, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad ran the fishing line, and that was their main railroad up through Michigan. And they advertised all the different places that you could go fishing along the different stops on that line. They later have one similarly that talks about where you can go golfing, where you can go hunting, and they lay out all of the different attractions along their rail lines. At the same time, they are marketing hotels and different resort and areas where you can stop along the way to learn more about the local area. Railroads aren't the only companies, of course, at this time that are transporting large amounts of people. Steamships is the other main mode of transportation. Again, this is 1870s, 1880s. This is well before the automobile. And the transportation companies, these large companies, often owned multiple steamship lines, multiple railroad lines, and really were very large corporations. So some of the steamships that would come to Harbor Springs, because we have that deep natural harbor, they were able to stop here when they couldn't at some other locations. So this one, for example, the Manitou Steamship Company, the Manitou came from Chicago. It was a 24-hour trip, and they deposited several hundred passengers at a time on our docks. These are just a few other tickets and little publications that were put out by the steamship companies. Here you can see two of the other steamships. This one in particular, I love this image. This is roughly where today's Pier Restaurant and the main city dock here in downtown Harbor Springs is. And you can see, I believe this is the Manitou. This huge steamship just pulled right up to the dock there. We also had the Northland, the Northwest, and many other large steamships coming in, not just from Chicago, but from across the Great Lakes, from Cleveland, from Detroit, and they often had stops in Mackinac as well. So we have these transportation companies advertising northern Michigan, and it works. People start coming up here. So one of the very first resort communities that we get in our area is Bayview over in Petoskey. Bayview is actually, it's founded, again, 20 years after that 1855 treaty expires. And Bayview is founded by a group of Methodist ministers from Jackson, Michigan. They arrive in Petoskey looking for a place where they can organize a camp meeting. These camp meetings are part of sort of the what you could call the third sort of Great Awakening or revival movement. And they are just a popular form of gathering. It usually lasts about a week. There are religious talks, there are sermons, there's singing, and these camp meetings are extremely popular at this time. And between the city of Petoskey, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, and the group of Methodists, the Congregation of Methodists from Jackson, they come together and create Bayview because it's going to be advantageous, obviously, to all three of those parties. Now, the first group of people who come for these camp meetings, the first camp meetings in 1875 and 76, and into 77, they are literally camping. Again, the Victorians were sort of the founders of this camping craze, and so they are out there in their corsets and crinolines in tents. And you can see some of the tents set up in the wilderness here in Bayview. It reminds me a little bit of Blissfest, actually, like we have today. Getting to gather around in these tents, singing, dancing, celebrating. Here's some other early images of Bayview. Oops. This one is from one of the very first meetings there, 1877. Now, the campground at Bayview grows exponentially. About 10 years later, by 1887, they have 125 summer cottages. They have a hotel, a chapel, and much more. And the program has grown from just a week to an entire summer-long program. And again, this could be an entire lecture on each of the different resorts that I'm going to mention. But luckily for us, here at the History Museum, we welcomed the archivist from Bayview Association this summer, and she did an absolutely lovely lecture for us that did last an hour and is currently, let's see, it's currently processing on my page to be up on our YouTube page very soon. So this is just a reminder that in case you didn't know, we share as many of our recorded programs as we can on our YouTube page. If we're able to record and get those edited, it depends on who the speaker is, whether or not we're allowed to record, but we post those for free on our YouTube page. And we're able to post those for free because of your support in attending programs like the one we're having tonight. But in the next couple of days, you will see the Bayview lecture pop up on our YouTube page, and I encourage you to go and watch that and learn more about the history of that great resort. It's a little bit of a unique one because it is founded as a camp meeting and part of that sort of religious revival movement, which is not what is happening at the other resorts particularly. So again, our YouTube page, please be sure to go and visit it. So we have Bayview around the bay in Petoskey, and around our area, closer to Little Traverse, we get our first resort founding in 1878 with Wequitansing. You might recognize that name. It's a slightly different spelling, but it's the same Odawa word originally used for Harbor Springs that means small bay place or little bay place. Bayview was first, but in our area, in about 1877, roughly into 1878, the Presbyterian Summer Resort Association is founded. So their first name is the Presbyterian Summer Resort Association. They renamed themselves Wequitansing a little bit later. But Harbor Springs at this point, again, is recognizing the importance of bringing people to our town and the economic boom that will provide. And so it's actually Harbor Springs who gifts the Presbyterian Summer Resort Association 80 acres of land east of town for them to incorporate their resort. Wequitansing is known particularly for its many clear creeks, artesian wells, and sandy beaches. Now, again, originally, people who are visiting Wequitansing are camping. They are literally pitching tents and staying at the resort. But many resorts realize that this is not necessarily the most ideal form of visiting. And so resort hotels become extremely popular. All the resorts in our area, which I'm going to talk about a few others here in a moment, have the resort hotel in common. And so I thought we'd take a brief detour here to talk about them and their purpose. So, resort associations function and gain revenue by selling shares of the association to people who would like to build a cottage or to be coming up there permanently, who want to buy into the association. So it might seem a little strange now to think of all of these resorts having hotels because nowadays the people who come up to Weequatanzing or to Bayview come up and go to their cottages. But when the resorts are first starting out, there aren't any cottages. So the hotel is a place where visitors to the resort can come up, they can stay, they can enjoy all the benefits of the resort, and hopefully are encouraged to purchase a share, purchase a lot in the association. And so when they're first getting started, of course, this is extremely important because not all resorts are successful or last particularly long. There are many, many resorts in our area that have just faded away, um, sort of after this sort of craze for, these couple of decades. The idea of a summer resort just faded away. But in order to be self-sustaining, in order to have a membership dedicated to your resort association's goals, you needed people to buy into it. And so building these hotels encouraged guests to come up and enjoy the resort before they buy into it permanently. And you can see on the right here, this is the Weequatanzing Hotel. And on the left, this is the Roaring Brook Inn. This is another image of a few of the different hotels, the Weequatanzing Hotel in the area. And one of the other reasons to have a resort hotel, not just to give prospective association members a place to stay, but because once they did build a cottage or decide to purchase a share, again, most of these early dwelling places, it's a tent or it's a small, very modest cottage, often and almost always without kitchens. Kitchens are hot, they're cramped, they are fire hazards, and if anything, cottages might have a little lean-to or summer kitchen attached. But for the most part, meals were taken collectively at these resort hotels. And so having a hotel, again, was extremely important so that your residents could get together and take their meals. Many of the resort hotels served that purpose extremely well until the advent of more modern cottages with electricity, with refrigeration, with kitchens of their own. Once the 1920s, 1930s roll around, many of these resort hotels are finding themselves without much of a purpose. Most of the lots in the associations have been sold. Guests who are coming up are mostly staying in cottages with relatives. So really, the hotels become superfluous, and most of them either burn down or are torn down. Some of the few that still remain, for example, are the Colonial Inn in Weequatanzing, which was founded in 1894. That is still around. Mononaqua Inn is still around, but otherwise, many of them have unfortunately been torn down at various points. So moving back, in 1878, we have the founding of Weequatanzing. And again, a quick plug, our YouTube page has an entire lecture with a fantastic Weequatanzing resident named Gibson Worsham, who literally wrote the book on the history of Weequatanzing. And his lecture goes into much deeper detail about the founders themselves and a little bit more of the history of that association. But Weequatanzing, founded in 1878, in the exact same year, we have the founding of the Lansing Resort, or as it comes to be known, Harbor Point. So in 1878, there's a group of businessmen from Lansing who come up to the area to escape Lansing and to escape the city, and they camp and hunt and fish on Harbor Point, on that little peninsula of land, and are so enchanted by their trip that they purchase the property and incorporate as originally the Lansing Resort, and later they changed their name. The resort is extremely popular. They build their first clubhouse or hotel very early on. And by 1880, just 2 years later, they have hired a landscape architect named John Swift to lay out and design their association. So he lays out um, where all of the carriage paths are going to be, where the hotel's going to be, these little decorative locations of copses of trees and gardens. And really, that layout remains the same to this day. Here's a few more images of the Harbor Point Clubhouse. That very first hotel, or clubhouse as it was called, had about 22 rooms, but it was remodeled fairly quickly. By 1911, it has 66 rooms, and it continues to grow after that. This is a later look at the clubhouse. It has grown substantially. The clubhouse eventually also includes a dining hall, card rooms, housing for staff, a parlor, those types of things. Now, by again, about the 1960s or so, the hotel itself, again, is rather superfluous. You don't have very many people coming to the Harbor Point Association who don't already have a cottage or who aren't staying with family. And the association sees that the expense of maintaining this century-old wooden hotel is just no longer worth that expense. And so it's torn down in about 1963. Here's just a few more images of the Harbor Point Association, some of the cottages on the left. Now, initially, as I mentioned, cottages were very simple affairs, very modest structures, and they remain modest for the first maybe 20 years or so. But of course, by the turn of the century, by 1910 especially, these cottages are 30 years old, more than 30 years old, and many of them get a facelift or are completely torn down and rebuilt. And many of the cottages that we see today are from this sort of second wave of cottage building or later. And the ones that you see in this image, obviously on the left, have undergone quite a bit of renovation and expansion throughout the years. Just a few more images of Harbor Point. I love this one of the gate, these two very serious looking youngsters there. Moving forward, we have, we had Wequitansing and Harbor Point in 1878. Just a few years after is Roaring Brook. Roaring Brook isn't officially platted until 1902, but the land for the association was purchased back in 1880 by William Crosby and some other Lansing businessmen. Again, that Lansing connection. And they found the association very early on, shortly after his purchase of that property. By 1895, so just 15 years or so later, it is a fully developed resort. They add a dock. They carve all sorts of beautiful little pathways into the hill, and they plat the association. You can see a little view of the plat there from 1902. And of course, the name for this resort comes from the very famous Roaring Brook itself. I think we have more pictures of this brook in our collection than almost anything else. The famous Roaring Brook is basically just a creek and a confluence where all these little creeks and artesian well-fed streams meet up and flow into Little Traverse Bay over this particularly artful fallen tree. So I think I have another picture later of that Roaring Brook. Roaring Brook gets its own hotel, of course. This is the Roaring Brook Inn. It was considered one of the quote unquote best of the local resort hotels and was advertised as being perhaps the most open and airy of these early resorts. It begins to be managed by a person named Thomas Leahy by about 1897. The Leahy brothers, there were four brothers who arrived in Harbor Springs around the turn of the century, and they operated many of the hotels in the area, starting with the Roaring Brook Inn in 1897, but they also opened the New York Hotel, where today's New York restaurant is, in 1904. Now, the Roaring Brook Inn itself, and this is another image of the inn at the back of the golf course. You can see some of the golf links in the foreground and the inn in the background. It is managed by many other people over the years, ending with Fred Ranker. Mr. Ranker poured about $50,000 into the inn during an extensive remodel in the 1950s. Unfortunately, the inn itself will be lost to a devastating fire in 1956 and is never rebuilt. So again, one of those resort hotels that ebbs away. Now, again, there are many other resort communities that we don't unfortunately have time to go into. I covered the big three, Weequatonson, Harbor Point, and Roaring Brook, but there was also Ramona Park, Mononaqua, Idlewild, Harbor Cove, Forest Beach, many other little resort associations springing up around the area. Ramona Park begins closer to World War I and is known for the Ramona Park Hotel. It's later renamed the Harbor Inn, and its great red roof is what many people remember it for. So a little bit more about this era. So with the coming of all of these resort associations, they're founding again the late 1870s, early 1880s. So by the turn of the century, by 1900, Harbor Springs is just an absolutely booming place. So there's a lovely quote from the local paper, the Emmett County Independent, that describes, this is actually them describing the railroad trip from Petoskey to Harbor Springs right after it opened in 1882. They say, on Saturday morning, we had the pleasure of riding over the long expected, long looked for railroad. It is not the best railroad in the world, but to eyes that have vainly been looking for it for many years, it is, without exception, the best looking road they have ever seen. And although we had visited numerous lively and beautiful towns, we returned to Harbor Springs with the feeling that we had seen no place anywhere we would rather live. So the railroad arrives, the resort industries are beginning to boom. By 1882, so this is pretty early on, by 1882, we have in town a drugstore, two grocery stores, two men's clothing stores, a meat market, a bakery, a jewelry store, a boot and shoe store, numerous blacksmiths, liveries, stables, doctors, barbers, lawyers, two saloons, and many different lumber industries. For example, we had E.L. Marshall's toothpick factory and the Cadillac broom handle factory. So Harbor Springs is really a busy, booming place. We had this image on the right I love. It's Babcock Florals, which was in the area of Weequatonson or so. It was founded by 1903 and was a rapidly growing business. By 1909, the newspaper reports that Babcock Floral had the largest flower and vegetable garden in northern Michigan, covering 17 acres of excellent land. One of the local businesses that did the best, you could say, were local hotels. So as I mentioned, there were hotels in the resorts themselves, but many different tourists visited Harbor Springs and didn't stay in one of the resorts. They weren't coming up to be part of a resort association. They were simply coming up as tourists to enjoy northern Michigan and everything that it had to offer. And so there was a need for hotels in downtown Harbor Springs. The first hotel in the area was called the Star Hotel. It was located to the east of Holy Childhood School on Main Street. It's later renamed the Globe Hotel. It's roughly today, I would say, where Johans is, between Johans and Holy Childhood Parish Hall. The Globe, as it was called, was built by about 1883 and operated by a gentleman named George Lewis. Eventually, the Globe Hotel is actually sold to Holy Childhood School and is converted into a dormitory for their male students. Another early hotel located on Bay Street this time, right off the water, was the Emmett House. The Emmett House got its start by 1876, so again, a very early hotel. The person who built that was George Dickinson. He was also the village supervisor, the sheriff, and the county clerk during his lifetime. He eventually leaves the hotel business and starts a livery stable in the area. But the new Emmett Hotel flourishes. Around 1900, it gets an annex. So this is the original Emmett House. And then this brick section here is the new Emmett addition that is added on to it. Here you can see that much more clearly. Here is the Emmett House. And after a remodel, the Emmett House is looking super spiffy, and then they add this brick area here. This is the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad track running right in front of it on Bay Street, and then the water would have been right past that. Now, the grandest of these early hotels in downtown Harbor Springs is, without a doubt, the Kensington. The Kensington was known by many names throughout its time. It first was called the Lake Park House and later called the Dewey, but it was constructed around 1882, and it was a 4-story wooden hotel. And it changes names many times, as I mentioned. It was located on the property of today's New York restaurant. It took up that entire block. So the New York restaurant today would sit in this open green space in front of the hotel. But at the time, it was the Kensington and this lovely lawn that had a artesian spring right in the center of it as well. Now, the Kensington, unfortunately, as a 4-story wooden structure, doesn't last particularly long. It opens in 1882, and by 1899, just 18 years later, it burns completely to the ground. Thankfully, no one is injured in this. The fire occurs during the off season. I believe it was during April, and so no one is injured. But this is the aftermath of that fire. This is all that remained of the Kensington. This is just an image of a local cornet band on the Kensington's front porch. And the Kensington was, again, just a fantastic hotel. They had entertainments and balls, different dinners, almost nightly. They had a very large dining room and had their own, as I mentioned, artesian well on the property. Now, this image on the left here is from the local newspaper, and it says that it's opening for the season of 1888. And I include this image because it shows the first Harbor Springs Railroad Depot, which was actually this building set out on a pier over the water, and the Grand Rapids and Indiana ran along what is now Bay Street. Eventually, this depot actually burns down, and they build the new one, which is still standing today. They build that in 1899, actually the same year that the Kensington burns down. So, as I mentioned, I could go on and on, but we have reached almost an hour here, and so I will be stopping there today. But if you are all interested in some of these other resorts, I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about them and to visit our exhibit to learn more about them as well. So that is what I have for you tonight. I want to thank you all so much for attending. I'm leaving with this lovely image of Bay Street that includes the Emmett House Hotel and Shay's Hexagon House down at the bottom there as well. I will give everyone a second in case you have any questions that you'd like to put in the chat. I would love to answer questions if you have any of them. And again, a reminder to visit our YouTube page where we have those other previously recorded lectures, and we go into much greater depth about the history of the specific resorts, Bayview and Wequitansing, and a little bit more about that era. So thank you all again so much for joining me tonight. We deeply appreciate your support of this program and of our programming in general. We hope to see you at some of our other Zooms this February and our in-person talks, which will resume shortly thereafter. Hopefully all of you have a wonderful night and are warm wherever you are. We had about 3 feet of snow here, so was the RB Hotel renamed the Ramona Park. So the Roaring Brook Inn remained the Roaring Brook Inn. Ramona Park was located quite a bit further down down the shoreline towards Petoskey, and Ramona Park was eventually renamed the Harbor Inn. That's a good question. Thank you all for your lovely comments. That's very sweet. Do we have any other questions? So far, I think that is the only question. I'll give it another minute here just to see if anybody else is typing away. Please, if you have a chance, visit us here at the museum and see the exhibit. It'll be open for another few weeks before it closes. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. Thank you all again so much for joining me, and we look forward to seeing you at our next presentations.